Hi everyone, and welcome to the video lecture, Early Positivism. This video goes along with Chapter 5 of your textbook. The positivist school of criminology is one of the earliest forms of modern criminology. Although the deterrence theory was heavily grounded in criminal law in the United States, deterrence theories assumed that everyone had the same capability to rationally reflect on their actions and make logical choices of good and bad. If this were true, then crime should be evenly distributed across all geographic locations, all social classes, all racial groups, and all age groups. However, scientists examining crime levels find differences in these areas, suggesting that something other than a fully logical, rational thought process is guiding the decision to commit crime. Accordingly, early positivists argue that there were certain characteristics about an individual that made them more or less likely to commit crime. They developed the first biological and psychological theories of crime, which focus on an individual's biological makeup or their psychological state to identify what we've known as the born criminal. As your textbook discusses, some of the elements of early positivism continue to hold weight in modern criminology, although we do not rely on the original, more basic theories that were proposed by early positivists. In addition to changing the focus of criminological research towards individual traits, positivists were also recognized as providing the first scientific foundations for criminological research. Early positivists conducted scientific research to support or validate their theories. Even though we now discredit a lot of that research as unscientific and biased, the concept of scientifically testing criminological theory is a strongly emphasized component of modern theory development. So we have those attempts at early theories to thank for the use of testing in our current system. The earliest positivist theories to arise came from the biological perspective. These focused on the biological traits of an individual in order to identify superior and inferior status. Craniometry focused on the size of the skull. These scholars believed that having a bigger skull meant a larger brain and therefore a more superior individual. Phrenology focused on the shape of the skull, with scholars using the bumps and the other distinctions in the skull to identify superior and inferior individuals. Finally, physiognomy focused on identifying developmental problems in both the skull and other body parts as a way to classify inferior individuals. One thing that many of these early biological scholars had in common was that their work supported the superiority of white Anglo-Saxon individuals compared to other ethnic and racial groups. These findings were promoted by the use of biased research methodologies, like allowing the scientists to know the identity of each skull before it was examined, and also by a cultural bias that was linked to the social conditions and expectations of that time period. In the 1800s, when these early biological theories were being put forth and tested, slavery and colonial occupation were a large part of everyday life. Findings of white superiority, regardless of whether the findings were from the result of a conscious or an unconscious bias, provided support for the continuation of these issues. If white Europeans were a superior being compared to African natives, then the colonization of their country could be rationalized as a good thing for the African natives, since they would be exposed and led by a quote-unquote superior group. Early biological theories were also useful for supporting the idea of eugenics, which is the idea of improving the human species by selectively controlling the ability to reproduce. The idea was that if we can identify the superior and inferior individuals in society, we can stop the inferior from procreating, thus ensuring that our future is continued and the gene lines are reproduced only by those who've been labeled as superior. We'll talk more about the influence of biological theories on specific methods of eugenics later in this lecture, but these will include sterilization techniques and deportation. Now, the early biological theories all culminated in what is considered to be the first official criminological theory. In his publication, The Criminal Man, Lombroso argued for a new theory of criminal behavior that mixed all of the three previous concepts, craniometry, phrenology, and physiognometry, together. Under Lombroso's theory, some people lacked the evolutionary development that others did. These individuals were considered atavistic, or more primitive beings. Lombroso believed that atavistic individuals lacked the ability to make positive, pro-social decisions, and that their biological makeup would inherently lead to a lifetime of serious and violent crime. He called these individuals the born criminals. Because of their innate criminality, Lombroso argued that atavistic individuals should be identified early, even calling for teachers to identify atavistic children during school so that society could take measures to protect themselves from the individual. Lombroso developed a system of identifying atavistic individuals. Borrowing largely from previous scholars, Lombroso identified a series of stigmata, or physical manifestations of atavism that could be observed and documented. Although the list of stigmata changed over time, generally stigmata related to characteristics that were somehow different than normal. Things like having larger than usual ears, small noses, large lips, etc., would all be classified as stigmata. Lombroso believed that if an individual possessed 5 or more stigmata, then they were atavistic and therefore a born criminal. In addition to identifying born criminals, Lombroso believed that he could use atavistic feature identification to identify the guilty party during a trial, and he did so on numerous occasions, being classified as an expert witness by the courts. He also believed that he could identify which type of criminal the individual was likely to become. He differentiated the stigmata between burglars, murderers, shoplifters, and so forth. Now, like the classical theories, Lombroso's theory of stigmata and the atavistic individual has been proven completely invalid by modern researchers. However, at the time, his theories became really popular. Think about the time period of his publication. The Criminal Man was developed at the end of the 1800s, and he continued publishing his ideas into the early 1900s, right as the world saw an increase in fascist and Nazi promotion of ethnic superiority. Just like previous positivist scholars, Lombroso's ideas supported a eugenic philosophy, especially since many of the stigmata he identified were common characteristics of racial and religious minorities. It was due to his popularity of his theory and his use of scientific methodology, however flawed, that Lombroso has been called the father of criminology. Now, here are some of the photographs illustrating the stigmata that Lombroso identified. Notice things like unusual face shape, overly large foreheads, wide set and small eyes, prominent ears, etc. Anything that deviated from the usual was considered an indicator of a born criminal. Lombroso's theory was in direct opposite to the classical theorists from prior history. Rather than focusing on everyone's free will and logical decision-making abilities, Lombroso's theory argued that people act as a result of something that's innate with them and can't be changed. This makes his theory one of the first well-publicized examples of determinism. Determinism theories argued that individuals were crime-prone due to factors beyond their control. All of the positive school of criminology focuses on deterministic ideas, although the specific factor varies from biological factors to psychological factors to sociological factors. Interestingly, Lombroso's theory is considered a biological factor because most of his stigmata were derived from biological characteristics of the individual. However, as your textbook points out, Lombroso also classified non-biological traits, like tattoos, as stigmata, which confuse the biological and the social perspective. Lombroso also had interesting ideas about stigmata in women. Although he attempted to identify stigmata in female skulls and photographs, he noted that stigmata were relatively rare in female populations. He concluded that this was because women were less evolved than men anyway, and that their natural passiveness and their lack of intelligence stopped them from being criminals like their male counterparts. Like classical theorists before him, Lombroso's ideas have been largely discredited. So what is Lombroso's legacy in criminology? His primary legacy relates to his constant testing of his crime theory through the study of human skulls and photographs. Just like earlier positivists, his methods were highly flawed, but the concept of theory testing using empirical methods and documentation continues into modern-day criminology. Lombroso was also one of the first to apply crime theory to a courtroom case. Granted, criminologists today do not go into court and declare someone innocent or guilty like Lombroso did, especially by the shape of their head, but criminologists do use crime theory to provide expert testimony about why a defendant is not responsible for the crime or to explain why a defendant may have behaved in a certain way. Lombroso's theory of physical deformities impacting criminality also continues today in some form, although we don't use his stigmata as an identification. Modern testing has supported a link between minor physical abnormalities, such as webbing between toes, malformed ears, simian creases, etc., as having a link with increased offending risk. However, criminologists today are highly cautious when labeling these characteristics as criminal themselves. It's likely that there's also a social component to the offending risk, something that we'll discuss on the next slide with the IQ theory of criminality. Now, another early positivist was H. Goddard. Like Lombroso, Goddard believed that people were born with tendencies toward criminality. But rather than using physical features to diagnose criminality, Goddard used intelligence. Using the newly created IQ test, which was developed by Alfred Binet in the early 1900s at the request of the French government, Goddard proposed using IQ score cutoffs to identify superior and inferior individuals. On an IQ score, 100 is the average, and Goddard claimed that an IQ that was significantly below this average was the result of a feeble mind. He further delineated cutoff scores for degrees of feeble-mindedness, starting with the relatively high-functioning morons, then the imbeciles, and finally, the idiots. Goddard argued that the higher-functioning morons were actually the most dangerous for society, because these individuals would mingle enough in common society to get married and reproduce. Under Goddard's theory of intelligence, IQ was a static, inherited trait, so he believed that all of the offspring of a feeble-minded individual would be feeble-minded themselves. Goddard's theory have had some significant impacts on immigration and public health policy in the United States. Remember that Goddard, like Lombroso, was championing his theory at a time when the world was increasingly focused on the concept of superior beings and eugenics-focused policies. Since Goddard believed that the idiot mindset was inherited and could never be rectified, he argued for policies that would reduce the number of American citizens born from these unfortunate individuals. He and his research team set up stations on Ellis Island, where they identified so-called feeble-minded individuals based solely on their appearance, because he believed that with practice you could naturally identify these feeble-minded individuals. Goddard's identifications at Ellis Island resulted in numerous deportations, a fact that he was proud about. Like Locard, Goddard's identifications were heavily influenced by ethnicity. In his book, Intelligence Classification of Immigrants of Different Nationalities, which he published in 1917, Goddard asserted that most of the Ellis Island immigrants were mentally deficient, providing such statistics such as 83% of all Jews tested were feeble-minded, 80% of Hungarians, 79% of Italians, and 87% of the Russians tested were feeble-minded. Now, of course, he's documenting this by visuals only based on his test of feeble-mindedness, which wasn't even an IQ test, but that's how Goddard believed that he could identify intelligence at this point. In addition to impacting immigration policy, Goddard's theory was used to support sterilization policies for those individuals who came from feeble-minded parents. In a very unfortunate decision, the Supreme Court upheld the use of forced sterilization in the case of Buck v. Bell from 1927. The case related to an 18-year-old female named Carrie Buck, who was a ward of the state colony for epileptics and feeble-minded in Virginia. In addition to being a feeble-minded individual herself, Buck's mother was institutionalized in the same facility for feeble-mindedness, and Buck had given birth at one point to an illegitimate feeble-minded child. In court, the Virginia State Colony argued that their forced sterilization of Carrie Buck was perfectly legal due to an act in Virginia passed in 1924 that allowed for sterilization of so-called mental defectives, who the law claimed could become a menace to society if they were discharged and allowed to procreate. In their decision, the Supreme Court justices argued that it was part of a state's duty to maintain public welfare for its citizens. They compared the sterilization of so-called imbeciles to compulsory vaccination laws, both of which they believed provided an essential public service to society. As your textbook notes, the justices concluded in their report that, quote, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. Only one justice dissented with a majority opinion. Sadly, Carrie Buck's case was not unique. The process of forced sterilization continued on in the United States for the next 40 years, and it resulted in an estimated 60,000 involuntary surgeries. Buck's court case was the subject of a Lifetime film called Against Her Will, The Carrie Buck Story, in the early 1990s. As your textbook points out, the idea of linking intelligence with crime risk has been supported by modern criminologists, particularly that of verbal intelligence scores. However, unlike Goddard's theory, it's become very evident that intelligence can change over time. There's also a significant debate in the criminological literature about the influence of other factors on the supposed link. For example, a person with a low verbal IQ may have different difficulty communicating and forming social relationships. This in turn can lead to difficulty maintaining steady employment and maintaining stable family relationships. Both of these are well-known risk factors for crime themselves. So the question becomes, is the IQ the factor creating the increased crime risk, or does IQ simply cause a series of sociological concerns that then create the increased crime risk? And that's still up for debate. The last major early positivist theory we'll discuss is the body type theory, or somatyping, developed by William Sheldon in the mid-1900s. Sheldon's theory differed from the other positivist theories in that his theory of criminality linked both the biological process and the psychological process of an individual. Sheldon's theory was based on the medical discovery of 3 distinct tissue layers in developing fetuses: the endoderm, the mesoderm, and the ectoderm. Sheldon believed that as a fetus develops, the body emphasizes one of the 3 layers more than the other, and that this emphasis would eventually lead to a distinct body type. Individuals who favored the endoderm became endomorphic, or obese individuals. Those who favored the mesoderm became mesomorphic and had a muscular, athletic build. And those who favored the ectoderm became ectomorphic with a thin, lean body. Sheldon took his body type theory further than previous criminologists because he layered in a psychological causation of criminality on top of the biological body shape. He proposed that each individual body type fostered a different type of personality. Endomorphic, or obese individuals, were jolly and lazy. Ectomorphic individuals who possessed the taller, leaner builds would be introverted and shy. Sheldon's concept of a born criminal was the mesomorphs, those individuals who favored the middle layer of tissue. He believed that these individuals, who possessed a muscular, athletic body, were also the ones predisposed for criminality because they were risk takers and aggressive. Although we don't automatically label athletic individuals as criminals in modern criminality, later research has found a stable link between muscular and athletic body proportions and criminal activity. Now again, like IQ theory, the cause and effect pathway is not as clear as early positivists would have us believe. Like your textbook discusses, having a more muscular and athletic body proportion may be more socially desirable for street crime level criminal involvement, as would having a risk-taking and aggressive personality. So it's likely that persons with desirable body proportions and personality characteristics are drawn into criminality by others, rather than criminality being an inherent part of that personality or that biological profile. That's one of the things you'll find a lot in this course. Generally, criminologists searching for a more clear answer propose theories of crime that emphasize only one or just a few characteristics, when it's likely a combination of multiple things working together to actually create criminal behavior. All right, well, that completes your early positivism lecture. By now, you have gained an introduction to some of the earliest biological and psychological theories of crime, and you understand how they continue to influence modern criminological theory. Thanks for watching.